Welcome to this expository explainer, where we will conduct a rigorous, formal study of Genesis chapter 50 to illuminate God's sovereign providence. I am absolutely thrilled to be your guide as we open the biblical text together today. We are going to apply a literal, grammatical, historical framework to this profound chapter, carefully looking at how the closing of the book of Genesis serves as a magnificent capstone to the entire patriarchal narrative. So grab your notebooks and let's dive right into this. We aren't just reading ancient history today, we are uncovering the dynamic, beating heart of God's redemptive plan. Our academic journey today is going to follow a highly structured framework. We'll begin with the historical and cultural background, trace the biblical narrative flow, dive deep into the theological significance, extract some deeply practical spiritual lessons and application for our daily lives, and close out with a conclusion and final blessing. Now, before we begin our verse-by-verse exposition, to truly understand God's progressive revelation, we absolutely must anchor our text within the correct biblical dispensation. We are currently operating squarely within the dispensation of promise. This is the specific patriarchal era where God is working through direct, unilateral covenants made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Keep in mind, we have not yet reached the dispensation of the law given at Sinai, nor are we in the dispensation of grace under which the church operates today. Understanding this framework is absolutely critical because the literal land promises we are about to discuss are made exclusively to national Israel as an everlasting inheritance. It is a distinct geographical program separate from God's future spiritual program for the church. Let us examine the historical and cultural background. The text beautifully contrasts the temporary, highly honorable civic mourning customs of Egypt with the eternal covenant promise represented by the family tomb located over in Canaan. When Jacob dies in the opening verses, we see a really fascinating blend of cultures. Joseph orders the physicians to embalm his father, which was a 40-day process perfectly matching ancient Egyptian mummification standards. This is then followed by 70 days of national weeping. To put that into perspective, that is the time frame almost exclusively reserved for royalty. Yet this magnificent Egyptian pomp is solely to prepare Jacob's body for transport to the cave of Machpelah in Canaan. That purchased cave acts as a deeded anchor in the story. It represents a strict, literal claim to the actual physical land pledged by God to national Israel. It's a reminder that Egypt was never their final home. Later in the chapter, we note that Joseph lives to 110 years. Now, this isn't just a random piece of trivia. In ancient Egyptian literature, 110 was widely celebrated as the absolute ideal lifespan. By specifically recording this number, the biblical narrator is signaling God's immense blessing upon Joseph's life and his public service. It tells the original readers that Joseph lived a fully satisfied, honorable life in his host nation, functioning brilliantly in the secular government, while never once losing sight of his true identity and his future inheritance. He was in Egypt, but he wasn't of Egypt.
Let us examine the biblical narrative flow.
Mapping our study chronologically through the opening 14 verses, we witness a majestic state funeral that transforms private family sorrow into a massive public testimony. First, in verses 1 through 3, we have the formal embalming of Jacob. Then, after Joseph secures Pharaoh's explicit permission, an utterly massive procession leaves Egypt in verses 7 through 9, complete with chariots, horsemen, and Egyptian dignitaries. It's an incredible sight. In verses 10 and 11, the caravan halts near the Jordan for 7 days of intense, bitter lamentation, a mourning so profound that the Canaanite locals actually renamed the place Abel Mizraim, which means the mourning of Egypt. Finally, verses 12 through 14 detail the actual burial at Machpelah, fulfilling that patriarchal promise before the company turns around and goes back to Egypt. Following Jacob's burial, the brothers' resurfacing fear of retribution is immediately met with a monumental, anchoring declaration of divine providence from Joseph. With their father gone, the brothers naturally assume Joseph is finally going to execute vengeance for what they did to him decades ago. They fall before him as slaves, ironically fulfilling Joseph's teenage dreams right down to the letter. But Joseph answers with tears and profound God-centered humility. Listen carefully to his words in verses 19 and 20 of the NIV. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This right here is the theological climax of the entire book of Genesis. Joseph refuses the judge's seat, resting entirely on the sovereign, overarching plan of God. As the chapter concludes, Joseph's final oath regarding his bones serves as a very tangible marker of hope, and this brilliantly illustrates biblical prophetic fulfillment. Historically, at the end of Genesis chapter 50, Joseph dies, is embalmed, and placed in a coffin in Egypt. But he makes his brothers swear an oath to carry his bones up from Egypt when God eventually visits them. This prophetic action is a patient sign of future movement. It's a prophecy we see fulfilled sequentially hundreds of years later when Moses physically carries those bones out during the Exodus, and Joshua finally buries them in the promised soil. It's a literal, physical pledge of a journey not yet finished, proving once again that God's covenant with Israel is inextricably tied to the land. Let us examine the theological significance. Let's put our theologian hats on for a moment. Through a systematic lens, we observe the stark tension between human sin and divine providence. Let's break this down category by category. First, under hamartiology, which is the theological study of sin, we see man's undeniable malicious intent. Make no mistake, the brothers genuinely intended to destroy Joseph. Then, under soteriology and providence, we see God's sovereign intent. God did not author or cause the sin, but he completely overruled it to accomplish salvation, specifically the saving of many lives during a global famine. Finally, under Israelology, this text forces us to strictly maintain the theological boundary of God's distinct, literal land promises. The absolute insistence of both Jacob and Joseph on burial in Canaan proves that God's program for national Israel involves literal territorial geography, completely distinct from his spiritual promises to the New Testament church. So the absolutely crucial point here is how we formally define providence. Providence stands in full, blinding light in this chapter, and it refuses to clean up the sin of the brothers. Notice that Joseph doesn't look at them and say, "Hey guys, what you did wasn't actually that bad." No, the harm was very real. The betrayal was real. But providence is the sovereign goodness of God that bends those malicious human designs into saving purposes, all without ever endorsing the sin itself. God is so vastly sovereign, so infinitely powerful, that he can weave the darkest human betrayals into a breathtaking tapestry of deliverance, working far beyond our limited human sight. It is a stunning reality to rest upon.
Let us examine the spiritual lessons and application.
From this incredibly rich exposition, we can draw some highly practical, timeless applications for the believer today. First, we learn to grieve with both hope and careful order. Joseph wept bitterly for his father, but he followed through on his civic duties and his covenant commitments. Second, we must utterly refuse the judge's seat. Like Joseph saying, "Am I in the place of God?" we must leave vengeance strictly to the Lord. He alone is the righteous judge. Third, when addressing past wounds with others, speak the honest truth first, naming the harm for what it was, but follow it immediately with tenderness and comfort, just exactly as Joseph did. Finally, live out your public, earthly calling with absolute excellence. Just as Joseph masterfully administered the empire of Egypt, do your earthly job well, but do it without ever losing your promise-shaped identity as a citizen of heaven. Let us examine the conclusion and final blessing. The book of Genesis closes not in the cold, strict administration of justice, but rather in warm, pastoral care, as we see beautifully captured in verse 21. Joseph promises provision and speaks kindly to the very men who threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery. This perfectly mirrors the God who comforts the contrite and feeds the fearful. You know, the book of Genesis could have easily ended with a magnificent display of righteous wrath, but instead, it ends with a weeping brother extending grace. It braids together mercy and mission until hope has a very distinct shape, a shape that can be safely carried forward into the next great chapter of redemptive history, the book of Exodus. What a truly magnificent conclusion to the foundational book of our faith. It demonstrates so clearly that the Lord's intentions do not end at graves or earthly regimes. He writes good through harm and keeps his oaths with absolute, literal exactness. So we must ask ourselves today, in the midst of our own deepest trials, our own betrayals, are we willing to trust that the penman of Genesis is still actively writing our story for good? May the grace and peace of our sovereign Lord be with your spirit, equipping you to trust his unfailing providence in your own life today and always. For more in-depth studies, visit the Grace and Knowledge series blog at woody-brohm.online.